On March 29, 2017, the safety of a quiet neighborhood in Incheon, South Korea, was shattered by a nightmare that would later inspire the hit Netflix series, Juvenile Justice. An 8-year-old girl vanished from a playground in broad daylight, only to be discovered hours later in a condition too horrific to describe, dismembered and discarded in trash bags atop a residential water tank. There was no ransom demand. There was no motive. There was only a 17-year-old neighbor who treated murder as a game. Before we uncover the chilling truth behind this tragedy, please consider subscribing to the channel to support our investigations. If you are a fan of Korean cinema, or simply someone who follows intense international criminal cases, you have likely heard of the drama series Juvenile Justice, released in early 2022. The series drew heavy inspiration from real-life events that shook the nation of South Korea. One of the most haunting cases, featured in the very first 2 episodes, is the story of the elementary school student dismembered in the city of Incheon. Today, we are going to walk through the timeline of this crime, a case that terrified a nation, and I invite you to analyze the details with me. We need to look at the red flags and the forensic puzzles that left detectives sleepless. The nightmare began in the early afternoon of March 29, 2017. At the Incheon police station, the phone rang with a call that every officer dreads. On the other end of the line was a young couple, their voices trembling with a mixture of panic and desperate hope. The husband explained that they had lost contact with their 8-year-old daughter. She had gone to school that morning, just like any other day, but she had simply vanished. Police officers were immediately dispatched to the family's residence to gather critical details. The clock was already ticking. In missing child cases, the first few hours, often called the golden time, are the most crucial. Upon arrival, the detective sat down with the mother, who was struggling to keep her composure as she recounted the day's events. The missing girl, whom we will call Haimei, was a bright and responsible 8-year-old. Her mother explained that she had walked Haimei to school that morning. Afterward, the mother returned home to tend to her daily chores. The school was located very close to their apartment complex, a short and safe walk that hundreds of children made every day. Because of this proximity, it was their routine for Haimei to walk home by herself after her morning classes finished. The mother explained a specific safety rule they had in place. If Haimei was ever going to be late, or if she could not make it home immediately, she would borrow a teacher's phone to call her mother. But that day, the phone never rang. Noon came and went. The silence in the apartment grew heavier with each passing minute. At first, the mother tried to rationalize the delay. Perhaps Haimei was just having too much fun with her friends and forgot to check in. It is a thought process many parents go through. Denial is a powerful defense mechanism. But as the clock ticked into the early afternoon, that denial crumbled. The mother rushed out of the apartment, scanning the streets, the park, and the usual route her daughter took. She asked passers-by, looked into alleyways, and checked the local convenience stores. There was no sign of her. By this point, the mother's intuition was screaming that something was wrong. She stopped hesitating. She ran back home and called the school. The teacher's response was the first blow. All the students have already left for the day. Panic set in. The mother began frantically calling the parents of Haimei's classmates, hoping against hope that her daughter had simply gone to a friend's house for a play date. One by one, the other parents answered. No one had seen her. No one knew where she was. When every logical possibility had been exhausted and every hope extinguished, she called her husband. They made the decision instantly. Call the police. When the authorities arrived, their assessment was grim. An 8-year-old child does not simply run away from a happy home without a trace. The prevailing theory shifted immediately to kidnapping. The detective suspected Haimei was being held hostage. If this was a kidnapping for ransom, the perpetrators would likely make contact soon. They would want money, and they would use the child as leverage. The police set up a surveillance operation inside the family's home. They tapped the landline and waited for the phone to ring. They waited for the demands. The parents sat by the phone, staring at it, praying for a voice on the other end, even if it was a criminal's voice, just to know their daughter was still alive. The afternoon dragged on. The sun began to lower in the sky. The phone remained silent. The shift from anxiety to sheer terror was palpable. By now, the news of Haimei's disappearance had rippled through the neighborhood. In close-knit apartment complexes in South Korea, neighbors often watch children grow up. They become a collective family. When they heard the news, the residents mobilized. They formed search parties, combing through the complex, checking the playgrounds, and widening the search radius. Despite the expanding manpower, the search yielded nothing. No backpack, no shoes, no witnesses. As the sun began to set, a new theory emerged among the search party. Could it have been a traffic accident? It was possible that Haimei had been struck by a car on her way home, and a panicked driver had abducted her to hide the evidence. It was a dark theory, but it gave the police a tangible direction. They immediately went to the traffic division and pulled the surveillance footage from every camera covering the roads around the school. Incheon is a highly monitored city. If a car had hit a child, a camera would have seen it. The detectives scanned hours of footage, frame by frame. They looked for screeching tires, erratic driving, or a child stepping into the street. But the footage showed nothing. The streets were calm. There had been no accidents in the vicinity during the time Haimei went missing. As twilight settled over the city, the investigation hit a wall, but then detectives decided to re-interview Haimei's classmates. They needed to find the last person who saw her. This legwork finally produced the first solid lead of the investigation. They found a young classmate who had walked part of the way home with Haimei. The police sat down with the child, speaking gently, trying not to scare her while extracting critical information. "You and Haimei left school together around noon, right?" an officer asked softly. "Yes, we walked home together," the little girl replied. "Where did you say goodbye to each other?" The girl thought for a moment. "At the playground in the park." The police pressed further. "Why didn't you go all the way home together? Why did you stop at the playground?" "We saw a lot of other kids playing there," she said innocently, "so we went over to watch." "And did you leave the playground with Haimei?" "No," the girl said. "I left by myself. Haimei said she wanted to call her mom, so she went to borrow a phone from someone. I waited for her for a long time, but she didn't come back, so I just went home." The detective's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment of abduction. "Did you see who she borrowed the phone from?" The child nodded. "I saw a lady. She was wearing sunglasses. She was holding a big suitcase. Haimei went with her, but she told me she would be right back." "How old was this lady? What did she look like?" "She looked about as old as my mom," the girl said, struggling to be precise. It wasn't much, but it was a profile. A woman, likely in her 30s, wearing sunglasses and dragging a large suitcase. The suitcase detail was particularly alarming. Why was someone dragging a suitcase through a playground? The police profiled the suspect immediately. She likely lived near the park. A person dragging luggage through a residential park was either returning from a trip or preparing to leave. She wouldn't have walked far on foot with a heavy bag. The police refocused their search grid. They targeted the apartment buildings, factories, and residential communities immediately surrounding the park. They were looking for a woman with luggage. At 8 o'clock that evening, a search team found a small, heartbreaking clue. Under a bench in the park, they discovered a hair clip. The parents confirmed it belonged to Haimei. She had been there. The witness was right, but the trail went cold again until 10:30 that night. On the roof of a residential building within the complex, near the mechanical room for the water tanks, officers made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. They found Haimei, but it wasn't the rescue mission they had prayed for. The little girl who had left for school that morning with a bright smile was gone. In her place was a pile of unrecognizable remains. The body had been brutally dismembered. Her clothing had been stripped off and stuffed into plastic bags nearby. When the parents arrived at the scene and saw the reality of what had happened to their daughter, they collapsed. The grief was so physical, so violent, that they fainted on the spot. The forensic team took over the rooftop. Even seasoned crime scene investigators were shaken by the brutality. Based on the state of the remains, the medical examiner estimated that Haimei had died between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock that afternoon. The cause of death appeared to be strangulation. There were distinct ligature marks on the skin around her neck, suggesting the killer had used a thin cord or cable to choke the life out of her. But as the police began to piece the body together, the horror deepened. The mutilation was specific and bizarre. The body was missing a finger and several internal organs. Furthermore, the crime scene didn't make sense. Dismembering a human body is a messy, bloody process. It creates a massive biohazard scene. Yet, on this rooftop, there was almost no blood. The cuts on the body were jagged and uneven, suggesting the killer did not use a professional tool, perhaps a standard kitchen knife that wasn't particularly sharp. The detectives were baffled. This didn't fit the profile of a kidnapping gone wrong. Kidnappers want money. If a kidnapping goes south and they kill the hostage, they usually dump the body quickly and flee. They don't take the time to meticulously dismember the victim, remove specific organs, and package the remains in bags. This wasn't about money. This was about something else. The police convened an emergency meeting. The conclusion was unanimous. This was the work of a psychopathic killer. This was a thrill kill. They analyzed the rooftop scene again. Since there was no blood, the roof was merely the dump site. The murder and the dismemberment had happened somewhere else, somewhere private, likely indoors, where the killer had access to water and tools. The killer had then transported the bagged remains to the roof. This insight narrowed the search radius drastically. The killer had to be close. It was highly unlikely that a woman based on the witness description would murder a child, cut up the body, and then transport heavy bags of remains across the city just to dump them on this specific roof. The primary crime scene had to be in this very building. The police locked down the building. They began a floor-by-floor canvass. They were looking for the auntie with the sunglasses. They pulled the CCTV footage from the building's elevators. After scanning hours of video, they found it. The footage showed Haimei and a person who matched the description perfectly. A figure with shoulder-length hair, wearing sunglasses, carrying a large bag, stepping into the elevator with the victim. It matched the classmate's story exactly. The elevator footage showed the pair exiting on the 13th floor. A tactical team immediately swarmed the 13th floor. They knocked on doors, checked residents, and looked for any sign of a struggle. But they found nothing. No suspicious individuals. No blood. No crime scene. The detectives were frustrated. How could a killer abduct a girl, lead her to the 13th floor, and then vanish without a trace? The suspect was clearly calculated. She hadn't just disappeared. She had outsmarted the initial sweep. Then, a detective noticed the fire exit door. By law, fire escape stairwells in these high-rise buildings remain unlocked for safety. Residents sometimes use them to skip the wait for the elevator. If the suspect got off on the 13th floor but didn't live there, she likely used the stairs to move to a different floor to throw off the trail. The police expanded the search, moving up the stairwell. They reached the 15th floor. They approached the apartment of a family named Kim. Inside, they found the items that matched the CCTV footage, the sunglasses and the suitcase. They were right there in the apartment. The team moved into the bathroom. It had been cleaned, but not well enough. Using luminol and careful inspection, they found traces of blood. The atmosphere in the room was electric. They had found the kill room. The killer was within their grasp. 10 minutes later, the door opened. A middle-aged woman walked in. The police immediately handcuffed her. She was the owner of the apartment, but she looked confused. She was terrified. She denied knowing anything about the blood in her bathroom or the missing girl. The police quickly verified her alibi. She was a professional working at a hospital. During the time Haimei was abducted and murdered, this woman was on shift. Her colleagues confirmed she had been at work all day. Furthermore, her clothing didn't match the suspect in the video. The police had to release her. But they didn't leave empty-handed. They took samples from the bathroom for DNA testing. They knew the killer had been in this apartment. As the police were leaving, a neighbor made a passing comment that changed everything. "Oh, the daughter in that family. She often wears sunglasses when she goes out." The detectives froze. The daughter. They had been looking for a woman in her 30s because the 8-year-old witness described an auntie. But to an 8-year-old, a 17-year-old teenager can look like a fully grown adult. The police set a trap. They waited. Hours later, the person they were waiting for returned. When the suspect was brought into the interrogation room, the entire station was in shock. The sadistic butcher who had lured, strangled, and dismembered an innocent child was not a hardened career criminal. She was a 17-year-old girl named Kim. With a pale, clear complexion and a seemingly harmless appearance, she looked like any other high school student. But the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA from the bathroom matched the victim. The CCTV placed her at the scene. Kim was the monster they were hunting. The interrogation room at the Incheon police station was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the chaotic emotions raging just outside its walls. Inside, detectives sat across from 17-year-old Kim, a girl who looked more like a student preparing for a college entrance exam than a suspect in one of the most gruesome homicides in South Korean history. She was small, pale, and quiet. Her demeanor was unsettlingly calm. There were no tears, no trembling, and no signs of the hysteria one might expect from a teenager accused of a capital crime. The lead investigator placed a photograph of 8-year-old Haimei on the metal table between them. The child in the picture was smiling, full of life, a painful reminder of who had been lost. "Do you know who this is?" the detective asked, his voice steady but heavy with accusation. Kim barely moved. She glanced at the photo with the casual indifference of someone looking at a weather report. "I do not know her," she replied softly. Her voice was flat, devoid of empathy. The detective did not blink. He knew the game was over before it had even begun. He reached into his file and began laying out the evidence, piece by damning piece. First came the CCTV stills, showing a figure in her mother's clothes walking with the victim. Then came the analysis of the blood traces found in her bathroom, hidden within the grout and drains blood that matched Haimei's DNA perfectly. Finally, he produced the timeline that placed Kim in the apartment alone during the exact window of the murder. As the weight of the evidence mounted, the mask of the innocent schoolgirl began to slip. Kim's expression shifted from indifference to a strange sort of solemnity. She realized there was no way out. But instead of breaking down in remorse, she simply shrugged, as if admitting to a minor infraction like skipping class. She looked the detective in the eye and offered a confession that chilled the blood of every officer in the room. "It was just a game," she said. The detective stared at her, unable to process the statement. A game? A child was dead, butchered and discarded on a rooftop. And this teenager was talking about it as if it were a quest in a role-playing video game. As Kim began to recount the events of March 29th, the full, terrifying scope of her psychological state became clear. She did not speak of rage or panic. She spoke of boredom and annoyance. On the day of the murder, Kim was at home, ostensibly napping. At 17, she should have been in high school, sitting in a classroom with her peers. However, Kim had dropped out of the traditional school system some time ago. She had always been a solitary figure, struggling to fit into the rigid social structure of Korean education. Instead of studying, she spent her days and nights in her room, immersed in the digital world, living a life disconnected from reality. That afternoon, she was trying to sleep, but the sounds of the outside world were intruding. The apartment complex had a playground directly below her window. It was a beautiful spring day, and children were running, screaming, and laughing. To most, it was the sound of joy. To Kim, it was an unbearable noise pollution. She got out of bed, her irritation spiking. She walked to the window and threw open the curtains, staring down at the playground from her high-rise vantage point. She watched the children running back and forth, small figures oblivious to the predator watching them from above. The irritation festered, but then it twisted into something darker. Kim picked up her smartphone. She opened a messaging app and contacted a friend she knew only through the internet, a person with whom she shared her darkest thoughts. She complained about the noise, about the children, but as she typed, her mood shifted abruptly. The annoyance evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. A smile crept across her face. An idea had taken root. Kim went into her mother's closet. She needed a disguise. She was 17, but she looked young for her age. To lure a child, or perhaps to distance herself from her own identity, she decided to play a role. She put on a set of her mother's clothes, an outfit that would make her look like an adult woman, perhaps a generic neighbor auntie. She found a pair of oversized sunglasses to hide her eyes. She grabbed a large suitcase. She wasn't going on a trip. She simply knew, with premeditated certainty, that she would need a way to transport something heavy later that day. She left the apartment and took the elevator down. She was not going for a walk. She was going hunting. Kim settled onto a bench near the playground. She sat quietly, hidden behind her dark lenses, and observed the chaotic energy of the children. She analyzed them like a biologist studying insects. She noticed that most of the children were well supervised, with parents or grandparents hovering nearby. There were no easy targets. She waited. Patience was part of the game. Then she saw her opportunity. 2 young girls were playing near the edge of the park. One of them, Haimei, looked distressed. She was looking around, clearly needing something. Kim listened closely and heard the girl say she wanted to call her mother, but didn't have a phone. Kim stood up. She smoothed out her disguise and approached the child. She adopted a soft, kindly voice, the voice of a helpful neighbor. "Do you need to make a call?" she asked gently. Haimei looked up at the stranger. She was hesitant, taught not to talk to strangers, but her need to contact her mother was strong. "Yes," the little girl said. "Can I borrow your phone?" Kim smiled sympathetically. "I would love to help you, sweetie, but my battery is dead." She paused for a beat, letting the disappointment set in, then offered the solution. "But I live right here in this building. I have a phone upstairs you can use. You can come up, call your mom, and come right back down." It was a classic lure, executed with terrifying naturalism. Haimei, worried about her mother worrying about her, made a fatal calculation. The lady looked nice. She lived right there. It would only take a minute. Haimei turned to her friend and said she would be right back. Then she took Kim's hand. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, the CCTV cameras captured them entering the lobby. They stepped into the elevator together. The doors slid shut, sealing the child in a steel box with her killer. Kim pressed the button for the 13th floor. This was the first sign of her forensic awareness. She lived on the 15th floor. By getting off 2 floors early, she was creating a gap in the digital trail. If the police checked the elevator logs for her floor, they would see nothing. They exited on the 13th floor. Kim led Haimei to the stairwell, and they walked up the 2 flights of concrete stairs to the 15th floor. The little girl, trusting and innocent, didn't question why they were taking the stairs. She just wanted to make her phone call. They entered the apartment. The door clicked shut behind them. Once inside, Kim did not immediately attack. She needed to keep the child calm while she prepared herself. She told Haimei to wait a moment. To keep the girl occupied, Kim introduced her to the family cat. Haimei, distracted by the animal, knelt to pet it, completely unaware that her life was measured in minutes. While the child played with the cat, Kim pulled out her phone. She sent a message to her online friend, the same one she had complained to earlier. "I caught one," she typed. She put the phone down. She went to a drawer and retrieved a tablet cable, a thin, strong wire. At around 2 o'clock, barely 30 minutes after they had entered the apartment, Kim approached Haimei from behind. The girl was likely still focused on the cat or waiting for the phone. Kim moved with sudden, violent efficiency. She looped the cable around the child's neck and pulled. The struggle was brief. An 8-year-old child is no match for a 17-year-old determined to kill. Haimei thrashed, fighting for air, but the wire cut deep, sealing her windpipe. Within moments, the movement stopped. The apartment fell silent again. Haimei was dead. For most people, the realization of having just taken a human life would bring about a crushing wave of horror or panic. For Kim, it seemed to trigger a shift into a methodical, almost industrial mode of operation. She dragged the small body into the bathroom. What happened next was a scene of unparalleled brutality. Kim did not just want to hide the body, she wanted to dismantle it. She took a kitchen knife and began the process of dismemberment. The police were baffled by the lack of blood at the scene, but Kim had been meticulous. She likely kept the water running, washing away the evidence as she worked. She cut the body into pieces, small enough to fit into trash bags, but simply disposing of the body was not enough. This was part of a game, and games have trophies. In a detail that sickened even the most hardened forensic pathologists, Kim selected specific parts of the victim to keep. She severed one of Haimei's pinky fingers. Then, she carved a piece of flesh from the girl's thigh. She took these items, remnants of a child who had been alive less than an hour ago, and washed them carefully in the sink. She found a glass jar. She placed the finger and the flesh inside, sealing it like a biological specimen. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the grisly work was done. The majority of Haimei's remains were double-bagged in heavy plastic trash bags. Kim carried them up to the roof of the apartment building. She dumped them near the water tank, a place she knew few people visited. She returned to the apartment and began the cleanup. She scrubbed the bathroom floor, the walls, and the drain. She used cleaning agents to break down the proteins in the blood. She worked with the focus of a professional cleaner. Then, she shed her disguise. She took off her mother's clothes and sunglasses. She dressed herself in her own clothes, an outfit that made her look like the teenager she was. She styled her hair and checked her reflection. The monster was gone. Only the sweet-faced girl remained. But she was not finished. She had a delivery to make. Kim grabbed her handbag. Inside, nestled among her personal items, was the glass jar containing the finger and the thigh flesh. She left the apartment, walking past the playground, where the search for Haimei was just beginning to ramp up. She walked past the worried neighbors and the gathering police presence. She walked to the subway station. Kim boarded a train bound for Seoul. She sat among the commuters, students coming home from school, office workers staring at their phones, elderly people resting their eyes. No one looked twice at the quiet girl with the handbag. No one knew that inches from them, inside that bag, were the trophies of a child murder. She was heading to meet the online friend. This mysterious figure was the audience for her performance. The text messages exchanged between them during this time revealed a disturbing dynamic. This was not just a solo act. It was a duet. Kim messaged the friend as she traveled. She was excited. She was bringing a gift. When she arrived in Seoul, she met a young woman at the station. This was Park, a 19-year-old who had been on the other end of those text messages all day. They met casually, like two friends meeting for coffee. Kim handed over the paper bag containing the glass jar. "Here," she said. "It is what you wanted." Park took the bag. She looked inside. She saw the finger. She saw the flesh. According to later testimony, Park did not scream. She did not run to the police. She looked at the gruesome contents and allegedly asked, "Is the finger pretty?" They spent a few hours together in Seoul, wandering the streets, knowing that back in Incheon, a family was being torn apart by grief. Eventually, they parted ways. Kim returned home late that night, walking back into a building that was now swarming with police. She went to sleep in her bed, just floors below where she had butchered a child, and floors below where that child's remains now lay decomposing on the roof. The game was complete, or so she thought, but the police investigation was relentless. When the detectives finally cornered her and extracted the confession, the sheer senselessness of the crime left a void that no explanation could fill. However, as the investigators dug deeper into Kim's digital life, they realized that Kim might have been the hand that held the knife, but she was not the only mind behind the murder. The text messages on her phone opened a new door in the investigation, a door leading directly to Park, the recipient of the jar. The detectives read through the chat logs, their stomachs churning. "I am going hunting," Kim had written before leaving the apartment. "Did you catch one?" Park had replied later. This was not just a case of a lone psychopath. This was a partnership, and now the police had to find the second monster. The arrest of 17-year-old Kim had provided the Incheon police with a physical body and a confession, but it had not provided a satisfactory answer to the question of why. The sheer senselessness of the crime, a teenager murdering an elementary school student because she was bored and annoyed by playground noise, felt incomplete. It was the digital forensic team that finally bridged the gap between a random act of violence and a calculated conspiracy. When investigators cracked open Kim's digital life, they found herself immersed not just in video games, but in a specific subculture of character role-playing apps. These are online spaces where users create avatars, build elaborate fictional backstories, and interact with others in text-based narratives. It is a world of fantasy, often harmless. But for Kim, the lines between the screen and reality had blurred irreversibly. Buried within thousands of lines of chat logs, the police found a singular, dominant presence. It was a user with whom Kim shared an intense, almost obsessive relationship. This was not a casual gaming buddy. The dynamic was distinct. The other user was the leader, the director, the master. Kim was the follower, the actor, the servant. The user was identified as Park, a 19-year-old woman living in Seoul. While the Incheon police were building their profile of Park, a gruesome discovery was being made 30 miles away in the capital. On the morning of March 30th, 2017, the sun was just rising over a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Seoul. A sanitation worker was making his rounds, clearing the street bins. It was a routine, monotonous job until he picked up a generic paper shopping bag that had been discarded in a public trash can. The bag felt unusually heavy and shifted strangely in his hands. Curiosity, or perhaps just a worker's instinct to check for recyclable materials, led him to look inside. He found a glass jar. At first glance, it looked like a science experiment, or perhaps some strange pickling project. But as he peered closer through the glass, the color drained from his face. Floating in the liquid was a human finger, severed at the joint, the skin pale and wrinkled from immersion. Next to it was a slab of fatty tissue, recognizable as human flesh. The worker recoiled in horror, dropping the bag and scrambling for his phone. He dialed the emergency number, his voice shaking as he reported finding human remains in a trash can in one of Seoul's wealthiest districts. When the Seoul police arrived, they cordoned off the street. They treated it as a potential homicide dumping ground, unaware that these were the missing pieces of the Incheon case. They pulled surveillance footage from the surrounding businesses and quickly identified a young woman depositing the bag into the bin. The woman in the footage was not a vagrant or a known criminal. She was well dressed, walking with the confidence of someone who belonged in this affluent neighborhood. Using facial recognition and local tracking, the police identified her as Park, a 19-year-old resident of the area. They brought her in for questioning. Park sat in the interview room, projecting an air of confused innocence. When asked about the bag, she shrugged. "I just found it," she lied smoothly. "I saw a bag on the street, picked it up, and threw it away. I did not look inside. I did not know what was in it." It was a flimsy story, but the Seoul police had a problem. They had a finger, but they had no body. They had no missing person report in their district that matched the remains. Without knowledge of the Incheon murder, which had happened only the day before in a different jurisdiction, they could not hold her on a murder charge. There was no evidence linking her to a violent crime, only the improper disposal of biological material. In a move that would later spark public outrage, the Seoul police released Park. They warned her not to leave the city, but she walked out of the station, a free woman. It was a catastrophic failure of communication between districts, a gap in the system that allowed a key suspect to slip through the net. It wasn't until later that day when the Incheon police sent out a nationwide bulletin detailing the missing body parts of Haimei that the Seoul precinct realized what they had found. The connection was made. The finger in the jar belonged to Haimei. Park was not a good Samaritan who found a bag. She was the recipient of a trophy. The Incheon police, armed with Kim's confession and the text logs, contacted their counterparts in Seoul. Park was rearrested immediately. This time, there would be no release. She was handcuffed and transported to Incheon to face the same detectives who had broken Kim. As the two suspects sat in separate interrogation rooms, the full, twisted narrative of their relationship began to emerge. Park and Kim had met in an online character role-playing community. In this digital world, they were not awkward teenagers. They were powerful, violent characters in a dark fantasy setting. Park played a dominant, masculine character, a boss figure who gave orders. Kim played a subservient, younger female character who executed those orders. Over time, the role-play bled into their real lives. They exchanged phone numbers and social media accounts. They began to speak to each other in character, even when discussing their real-world problems. Park became a mentor figure to the socially isolated Kim. The transcripts of their conversations on the day of the murder were chilling. They read less like a dialogue between friends and more like a handler instructing an asset. When Kim complained about the children playing outside, it was Park who allegedly escalated the fantasy into reality. "I am going hunting," Kim had typed. Park did not tell her to stop. She did not call the police. She played along. "Did you catch one?" she asked later. And when Kim confirmed the kill, Park's response was not horror. It was curiosity. "Is the finger pretty?" she had asked. This question, "Is the finger pretty?" became a lightning rod for the prosecution. It demonstrated a level of detachment and sadism that suggested Park was not just an accessory after the fact, but an active psychological participant in the crime. She had treated the murder of a child as an aesthetic event, a plot point in their shared story. The gift exchange was the climax of this twisted game. Kim had traveled to Seoul specifically to present Park with the jar. Park had accepted it, kept it for a period, and then, perhaps realizing the reality of holding human remains, discarded it like a fast food wrapper. With Park in custody, the police declared the investigation complete. They had the killer, the instigator, the weapon, and the remains. The case was handed over to the prosecutors, and the stage was set for a trial that would captivate and horrify the nation. On June 15, 2017, the trial began at the Incheon District Court. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from every major network jostled for position, while the public waited outside, demanding justice for Haimei. But as the legal proceedings opened, it became clear that this would not be a straightforward sentencing. It was a war. The defense teams for Kim and Park adopted a strategy that is as old as crime itself, the prisoner's dilemma. They turned on each other. Kim's lawyers argued that she was a victim of manipulation. They painted Park as the mastermind, a Charles Manson-like figure who had brainwashed a vulnerable, mentally unstable girl into committing murder. They claimed that Kim was so deep in the role-playing delusion controlled by Park that she lacked the capacity to understand the gravity of her actions. Park's defense was the exact opposite. They argued that Park thought it was all a joke. They claimed she believed Kim was still role-playing when she sent those texts. They argued that when Park accepted the bag, she didn't know what was inside, or that she was too shocked to react. They portrayed Park as an innocent bystander who got dragged into a psychopath's fantasy. However, the courtroom dynamic shifted When the public learned about Park's background, unlike Kim, whose family was relatively quiet, Park came from significant wealth. Her father was a high-ranking lawyer, and her family had deep connections in the legal and business worlds. Rumors swirled that her family was part of the Kibol class, the powerful business conglomerates that dominate the South Korean economy. This wealth was on full display in the courtroom. Park's family had hired a legal dream team. 12 top-tier lawyers filed into the defense benches to represent the 19-year-old. These were not public defenders. These were former judges and star prosecutors who charged exorbitant fees. The sight of 12 lawyers defending one teenager against the murder of an 8-year-old girl disgusted the public. It reinforced the cynicism many Koreans felt about their justice system, that money could buy freedom, even from the most heinous crimes. Kim's defense took a different, more clinical route. They played the mental health card. They argued that Kim suffered from Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism spectrum disorder. They also claimed she had dissociative identity disorder, implying that another personality had committed the crime. The defense team brought in psychiatrists to testify that due to her condition, Kim lacked empathy and the ability to distinguish between social norms and violent impulses. They argued that her obsession with gore and murder was a symptom of her untreated neurological condition, not a sign of evil. The goal was clear: to avoid the maximum sentence. Under South Korean law, juveniles are protected from the death penalty and life imprisonment. The maximum sentence a juvenile can receive is 20 years. However, if the court found she was mentally incompetent at the time of the murder, that sentence could be significantly reduced, or she could be sent to a treatment facility instead of a prison. For the American audience, this strategy is similar to the insanity defense, but with a specific focus on developmental disorders. The defense was trying to say she didn't know what she was doing because her brain is wired differently. But the prosecution was ready. They systematically dismantled the Asperger's defense. They pointed to the meticulous planning. Kim had worn a disguise. She had brought a suitcase. She had chosen a victim. She had deliberately exited on the 13th floor to avoid cameras. She had cleaned the crime scene with chemical agents to destroy DNA. She had traveled to Seoul to dispose of evidence. These are not the actions of someone having a psychotic break, the lead prosecutor thundered. These are the actions of a cold, calculating predator. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew it was wrong, and she took steps to hide it. The prosecution argued that Kim's flat affect and lack of empathy were not symptoms of autism, but of psychopathy. They painted a picture of a girl who viewed human life as expendable, a toy to be broken for her own amusement. As for Park, the prosecution focused on the power dynamic. They used the chat logs to show that she was the alpha. She directed the narrative. She encouraged the violence. They argued that without Park's validation and encouragement, Kim never would have escalated from fantasy to murder. Park provided the psychological permission structure for the crime. The trial dragged on, a grueling parade of forensic evidence and psychological evaluations. The parents of Haimei sat in the gallery every day, clutching photos of their daughter, forced to listen to the defense lawyers argue that the girl who butchered their child was the real victim of mental illness or bad friends. Public anger reached a boiling point. The notion that Park might walk free because of her expensive lawyers, or that Kim might get a light sentence because of a diagnosis, sparked protests. Petitions circulated online, gathering hundreds of thousands of signatures, demanding the maximum penalty for both. The text messages, which were released to the public during the trial, fueled the fire. The sheer banality of their evil, the casual way they discussed body parts and hunting, stripped away any sympathy the defense tried to manufacture. Park's claim that she thought it was a joke crumbled when the prosecution highlighted the physical evidence. She had held the jar. She had seen the finger. She had kept it. You do not keep a severed finger as a joke. You keep it because you like it. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, the judge was left with a difficult task. He had to weigh the brutality of the crime against the age of the defendants and the complexities of mental health law. But the question hanging over the courtroom was not just about legal guilt. It was about the nature of evil itself. Was Kim born a monster, or was she made one by the dark corners of the internet? And was Park simply a wealthy girl playing a dangerous game, or was she the true architect of the nightmare? The sentencing day approached, and the entire nation held its breath. The verdict would determine whether justice in South Korea could stand up to wealth, manipulation, and the most chilling defense of all, it was just a game. The courtroom in Incheon became the focal point of a national debate on the nature of evil and the limitations of the law. As the trial of 17-year-old Kim and 19-year-old Park reached its climax, the atmosphere was heavy, with a mix of anticipation and dread. The public, the press, and the heartbroken family of the victim were all waiting for one thing: accountability. But in the South Korean legal system, accountability for juveniles is a complex, often frustrating concept. The defense team for Kim had pinned their hopes on a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. They argued that her neurological condition made her unable to empathize with the victim or fully comprehend the morality of her actions. They painted her as a prisoner of her own mind, a girl who lived in a delusion where consequences did not exist. They claimed that the murder was an impulsive act driven by a mental break, not a calculated decision to destroy a life. However, the prosecution dismantled this narrative with cold, hard logic. They pointed to the timeline. A person in the throes of a psychotic break or a sensory meltdown does not typically have the presence of mind to wear a disguise to avoid identification. They do not think to exit an elevator 2 floors early to bypass security cameras. They do not calmly lure a child with a specific, relatable lie about a dead phone battery. And they certainly do not spend hours meticulously cleaning a crime scene with chemical agents to degrade DNA evidence. The judge agreed. In the final ruling, the court stated that the complexity of the crime proved Kim had full cognitive function at the time of the murder. Her actions showed a clear ability to plan, execute, and cover up a crime. The Asperger's defense was rejected, but then came the reality of the sentencing. Under South Korean law, the maximum penalty for a juvenile offender, someone under the age of 18 at the time of the crime, is 20 years in prison. Even for a crime as horrific as the abduction, murder, and dismemberment of an 8-year-old girl, the law did not allow for a life sentence or the death penalty. The judge handed down the maximum sentence available, 20 years in prison. In addition to the prison term, Kim was ordered to wear an electronic tracking anklet for 30 years after her release. She would be nearly 70 years old before she was truly free from state supervision. To the family of Haimei, this felt like a slap in the face. Their daughter's life had been stolen forever, yet her killer would walk free while she was still young enough to start a second life. Then, all eyes turned to Park. Park was 18 at the time of the crime, technically an adult in the eyes of the criminal court for capital offenses, though still very young. The prosecution had argued that she was the mastermind, the director who pulled the strings. They sought life imprisonment. In the initial verdict, the court agreed with the prosecution. Park was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The public rejoiced. It felt like justice. The wealthy girl with the expensive lawyers had not been able to buy her way out of consequences. But the victory was short-lived. Park's team of 12 elite lawyers immediately filed an appeal. They attacked the classification of her crime. They argued that while she may have encouraged Kim, and while she certainly aided in the disposal of the body parts, there was no physical evidence proving she explicitly instructed Kim to kill. They argued that the text messages were ambiguous, part of their established role-playing fantasy, and not a direct order to commit homicide. The appellate court was swayed. In a ruling that sparked protests across Seoul, the High Court reduced Park's charge for murder to aiding and abetting. Her sentence was slashed from life in prison to just 13 years. The logic was legalistic and technical, because there was no recording of a specific command to kill, and because Park was not physically present in the apartment. The court could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she was a co-principal in the murder. She was merely an accessory. The reaction was explosive. The public viewed this as a clear example of the Kibole system at work, the idea that the wealthy and powerful operate under a different set of rules than ordinary citizens. People were furious that a young woman who had received a severed finger as a gift, asked if it was pretty, and watched her friend hunt a child via text message, would be back on the streets in her early 30s. Following the verdict, more details of their digital correspondence were leaked to the media, fueling the fire. The transcript of the conversation before the murder was harrowingly casual. Kim had texted, "I am going hunting." Park had replied, "Did you catch one yet?" After the murder, when Kim was safely back in her room and the child's body was lying in pieces on the roof, she texted Park, "I am home. The situation is handled." Park asked, "Is she alive?" Kim replied, "No." Park then asked the question that would define her inhumanity. Was the finger pretty? Kim replied, "It was very pretty." These were not the words of a confused bystander. These were the words of an active participant in a macabre thrill. The public sentiment was that the law had failed to capture the moral reality of the crime. Park may not have held the knife, but she held the psychological leash. The parents of Haimei were devastated. They had lost their daughter to a senseless act of violence, and now they felt they were losing the battle for her memory. They launched an online petition, a desperate plea to the Blue House, the South Korean executive office, and the court system to reconsider the leniency shown to the killers. The father's letter, posted online, broke the hearts of millions. It read, "Hello everyone. We are the parents of Haimei, the victim of the Incheon murder case on March 29th. The tragic death of our child and the shock and grief of our family are things no words can describe. We are living in a nightmare that never ends. But I am writing this because I need your help. We must stop this from ever happening again in this country. We cannot let these murderers receive light punishments and return to society to harm others. If you agree with us, please sign this petition. Please help us ensure that the perpetrators receive the strict punishment they deserve under the law. Thank you for reading." Signed, the parents of Haimei. The petition garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures in a matter of days. It became a rallying cry for legal reform, specifically regarding the Juvenile Act. The South Korean public demanded that the age of criminal responsibility be lowered and that the protections for violent juvenile offenders be stripped away. Juvenile justice became a buzzword, eventually inspiring the drama series that brought this case to international attention. The case of the Incheon Elementary School murder serves as a terrifying, grim reminder of the modern age. It highlighted two distinct failures: the failure of the family and school system to notice the profound isolation and mental deterioration of a teenager like Kim, and the failure of the legal system to adapt to a world where reality and online fantasy are increasingly blurred. Kim and Park treated the murder of a human being as a quest, a mission to be completed for validation. They gamified death. They detached themselves from the suffering of their victims so completely that a severed finger became a collectible item, a token of friendship. While video games and the internet act as outlets for millions of people without issue, this case forced a conversation about what happens when those outlets become the only reality for a disturbed mind. It forced parents to look at their children's screens and wonder who they were really talking to. It forced society to ask whether a 17-year-old who kills with the precision of a seasoned predator should still be treated as a child. Kim is currently serving her 20-year sentence. She spends her days in a cell, far removed from the digital world that fueled her dark fantasies. Park, serving her 13-year sentence, will be released while she is still a young woman. She will have the chance to marry, to have a career, to live a life. Haimei will never have that chance. She remains forever 8 years old, a memory frozen in time, her life extinguished because two bored teenagers decided to play a game with the devil. As we look back on this tragedy, the remaining questions are uncomfortable. Did the system work as intended? Or did it allow a monster to manipulate the rules? And in an era where our digital lives are becoming just as significant as our physical ones, how do we stop the next Kim and Park from finding each other in the dark corners of the web? The story of the Incheon Elementary School murder is not just a story about a crime. It is a warning. It is a warning about the silent dangers lurking in our high-rise apartments and on our screens. It is a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not hiding under the bed. They are living right next door, hiding behind a pair of sunglasses and a smartphone. This case forces us to confront the terrifying gap between law and justice. Two teenagers turned a child's life into a prop for their twisted roleplay, yet one of them will walk free in her early 30s. It leaves a bitter taste, knowing that the legal definition of accomplice allowed Park to escape a life sentence despite her chilling involvement. What do you think? Did Park deserve the same sentence as Kim, or was the court right to reduce her time? And do you believe juvenile laws should protect offenders who commit crimes of this magnitude? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the cases that change the world. Stay safe, and thanks for watching.